I want you to imagine standing in a dark, totally trackless forest.
Oh, and a freezing one at that.
Exactly. It's November 1939. The temperature is so impossibly cold that, like, the engine blocks of vehicles are just freezing solid.
Yeah, right in the middle of the woods.
Right. And you are waiting for an army of 500,000 men and, I mean, thousands of tanks to cross the border.
It's terrifying.
It really is. A massive global superpower is invading its tiny neighbor, and they fully expect to be parading through the capital city in 2 weeks.
But instead of a parade, they walk straight into a 105-day frozen hell.
Yeah, they really did. And we're pulling from a comprehensive historical overview for this deep dive today. So we're looking at, declassified Soviet archives, finished frontline accounts, and broader geopolitical analyses.
Which is such a fascinating mix of sources.
It is. And the mission here is to unpack exactly how this severe underdog held the line against an absolute juggernaut.
Because it remains one of the most stunning miscalculations in modern military history.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Winter War. The 1939 to 1940 conflict between the Soviet Union and Finland. We are going to examine the mechanical reality of their desperate tactics.
And really explore how this relatively short, isolated conflict inadvertently reshaped the grand strategy of World War II.
So to really understand the mechanics of what happened in those freezing forests, we first have to look at the geopolitical chessboard, right?
Yeah. Before the shooting starts, we have to establish why the Soviet Union, which was already a massive empire, was so obsessed with the borders of a small Nordic country.
It came down to a very specific geographic vulnerability, didn't it?
It did, yeah. That vulnerability was the city of Leningrad, which we know today as St. Petersburg.
Okay, right.
In 1939, Leningrad sat a mere 32 kilometers, so that's about 20 miles from the Finnish border.
That is basically commuting distance.
Exactly. And Joseph Stalin was looking at the rising threat of Nazi Germany in Europe, and he was terrified that this proximity made the city indefensible.
Because if a hostile power used Finland as a staging ground, artillery could hit Leningrad almost immediately.
Yeah, the Soviet mindset relied really heavily on this concept of geographic depth. They viewed the extended borders of the old Tsarist Russian Empire as a necessary buffer zone to, absorb any invasion.
Which makes sense from a purely defensive standpoint.
Well, in late 1939, the Soviets and Nazi Germany had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Right, the infamous non-aggression treaty.
On paper, yeah. But the secret protocols of that treaty divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, placing Finland firmly in the Soviet sphere.
Wow.
So having just secured Eastern Poland, Stalin turned his attention north to secure that buffer for Leningrad.
But he didn't just order the tanks across the border on day one, right?
Correct.
He tried diplomatic strong-arming first.
He did. The Soviets invited Finnish representatives to Moscow and essentially demanded a massive land swap.
Right.
They wanted the Finns to move their border 30 kilometers further away from Leningrad, hand over several islands in the Gulf of Finland, and lease them a naval base.
And what did they offer in return?
They offered twice as much land further north in Karelia.
Which, I mean, if you merely look at the acreage, offering twice as much land seems like a diplomatic compromise.
Sure, on a map.
But the Finns vehemently refused. Because it's like asking a neighbor to voluntarily demolish the load-bearing wall of their house to give you a better view, and then offering them an empty lot down the street in exchange.
That is a perfect analogy. The land the Soviets demanded wasn't just arbitrary territory, it contained the Mannerheim Line.
Ah, okay.
That was Finland, the primary defensive fortification network across the Karelian Isthmus. Giving that up would essentially strip them of their only physical barrier against a Soviet ground invasion.
Which they knew was a real threat.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Furthermore, the Finnish government was closely watching the Baltic states, so Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania.
Right. What was happening there?
Well, the Soviets had just pressured them into signing these mutual assistance pacts, allowing military bases on their soil. The Finns correctly identified that as the first step toward total annexation.
So they knew that giving up that defensive infrastructure meant giving up their sovereignty.
Exactly. And when the diplomatic talks inevitably hit a brick wall, the Soviets basically decided to manufacture a reason to invade.
Right. And this brings us to November 26, 1939.
Yes. Soviet border guards in the village of Manila were suddenly hit by artillery fire.
And the Soviet Union immediately blamed Finnish artillery.
Right. They claimed it was a provocation and demanded the Finns pull their troops back from the border.
But wait, if the Finns knew they were, hopelessly outgunned, It makes zero sense for them to randomly fire artillery at a Soviet border town.
It makes absolutely no sense.
So how do we eventually confirm what actually happened there?
Well, we didn't have undeniable proof until decades later. When the Soviet Union collapsed and their state archives were finally declassified, historians found the direct orders.
Oh, wow.
It was a textbook false flag operation. The Soviet secret police, the NKVD, fired artillery on their own troops to manufacture a casus belli.
A legal justification for war.
Exactly.
The fact that they shot their own people just to manufacture a border dispute proves they had zero intention of stopping at that Mannerheim line we talked about.
No intention at all.
And we see that confirmed just days later, right?
Yeah.
Because they launched the invasion on November 30th and immediately set up a puppet government.
The Finnish Democratic Republic.
Right, which was meant to take over the entire country.
The intention of regime change was undeniably clear from the start. They had even commissioned a celebratory piece of music from the composer Dmitri Shostakovich.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, it was intended to be performed as the Red Army paraded through Helsinki in time for Stalin's 60th birthday in late December.
That is just astounding hubris. They expected a walkover.
To be fair, the sheer mismatch in numbers explains that confidence.
Yeah, let's talk about those numbers. The Red Army deployed something like 2,500 to 3,000 tanks and almost 4,000 aircraft.
Unbelievable numbers for the time.
And Finland had, what, exactly 32 tanks?
Yes, and most of them were obsolete Renault from World War I without properly fitted weapons.
Oh, man. And they had just over 100 combat-ready planes.
That's it.
So you have 500,000 Soviet troops rolling into a country defended by around 300,000 Finns, many of whom were just hastily recalled civilian reservists.
So on paper, it is a mathematical inevitability. But mathematics doesn't account for friction, and the Soviet military apparatus was generating its own friction before they even fired a shot.
Because of the purges, right?
Exactly. The Red Army was suffering terribly from Stalin's great purges. Out of sheer political paranoia, he had executed or imprisoned thousands of his most competent, experienced military officers.
Now, if you're listening to this and wondering how losing upper management affects the actual soldier in the snow, you really have to look at the dual command structure Stalin put in place to ensure loyalty.
It was a disaster. The experienced officers were replaced by inexperienced political yes-men.
And that dual command structure was fatal.
Yeah, a Soviet unit commander was not allowed to adapt to the situation on the ground without the explicit countersignature of a political commissar.
And this commissar is a guy whose only qualification was loyalty to the Communist Party.
Right. So if a commander wanted to flank an enemy position, but the commissar felt that deviating from the central plan was somehow defeatist, the maneuver was vetoed.
Which naturally leads to incredibly rigid, predictable tactics.
Very rigid. The Soviet doctrine of the time was heavily influenced by German blitzkrieg tactics in Central Europe. They relied on massive mechanized pushes down paved roads and open plains.
But Finland isn't Central Europe.
No, Finland is a trackless wilderness of dense pine forests, thousands of lakes, and deep swamps.
And the staggering hubris of trying to force a blitzkrieg through an Arctic forest resulted in scenes that are almost hard to believe.
Like the 44th Rifle Division.
Yes.
Yeah.
They were so certain of a rapid victory that they literally brought a full brass band with them to the front line for their anticipated victory parade.
It's tragic, honestly.
They marched right into the snow in dark khaki uniforms, hauling tubas and trumpets.
Meanwhile, the Finns recognized immediately that they could not meet this mechanized force head-on. Culturally, they leaned into a concept called sisu.
Sisu.
Oh.
How would you translate that?
Well, while it lacks a direct English translation, it essentially means extraordinary determination, guts, and an unyielding spirit in the face of impossible odds.
I love that.
And they paired that psychological resilience with deep environmental adaptation.
Which was born out of pure necessity because the Finnish military was so small, they didn't even have enough standard issue uniforms to go around, right?
Yeah, the soldiers simply wore their own layered civilian winter clothes and threw cheap white bedsheets or snow capes over them.
Making them practically invisible in the forest.
Exactly. By moving on cross-country skis, they could glide silently through the deep snow, completely bypassing the few dirt roads the Soviet columns were hopelessly confined to.
This mobility allowed them to get incredibly close to the Soviet armor.
And since Finland had almost no anti-tank guns, they had to invent close-quarters methods to stop a 10-ton armored vehicle.
Which sounds impossible.
A soldier would literally ski up to a moving tank and jam a log or a crowbar into the treads to immobilize it.
Wow. And once the tank was stuck, they introduced fire.
The Molotov cocktail.
Yes. The mechanics behind this improvised weapon are brilliant, but the name itself is pure weaponized Finnish sarcasm.
It really is.
When the Soviet Air Force started indiscriminately bombing the Finnish capital, Helsinki, the Soviet Foreign Minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, went on international radio.
And he made an outrageous claim.
He brazenly claimed that Soviet planes were not dropping bombs, but rather humanitarian food drops for the starving Finnish people.
So the Finns immediately started referring to the cluster bombs as Molotov's bread baskets.
Right. So when the Finnish troops started mass-producing glass bottles to destroy the tanks, they figured they should provide a drink to go with the food.
I mean, the dark humor is amazing.
It's so good. The mixture wasn't just simple gasoline, though. It was a specific mix of gasoline and thick tar, capped with a rag fuse.
The tar was the key ingredient.
Yeah. When the bottle shattered against the engine vents of a Soviet tank, the tar made the flaming liquid stick to the metal,
And as the fire burned, it consumed all the oxygen around the engine intake.
literally suffocating the engine to death while igniting the fuel lines. And they called them Molotov cocktails.
But, destroying a few tanks with bottles doesn't dismantle an army of 500,000 men.
No, it doesn't.
To understand how the Finns systematically broke down a force 10 times their size, we have to look at how they weaponized the freezing wilderness itself.
The environment.
Right. The winter of 1939 to 1940 was one of the coldest on record. Temperatures plummeted to minus 43 degrees Celsius.
Which is about minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit for our U.S. listeners.
Just unimaginably cold.
Hold on. I was reading through the Finnish frontline accounts we gathered, and Modi, the name of the famous tactic they used to destroy these columns, isn't some clinical military term, is it?
No, it's not.
Doesn't it literally translate to chopped firewood?
It does, and it paints a dark, highly accurate picture of the reality on the ground.
How so?
Well, the Soviet motorized columns were restricted to the few narrow logging roads cutting through the deep forests. Because of the terrain, a single division's column could stretch out for miles.
Right, they're just stuck in a line.
So the Finns, moving swiftly on skis through the surrounding woods, would launch sudden ambushes to fell massive trees across the road at the very front and the very back of the Soviet line.
They'd trap them in a single file line,
Exactly.
and then they would ski down the flanks of the trapped column and fell more trees to segment the line into smaller, isolated pockets.
They were looking at a living human column and methodically chopping it into blocks of wood to be burned and destroyed piecemeal.
It's so brutal.
It was a survivalist war. Once a column was chopped into these motes, the Finns rarely wasted their limited manpower attacking the heavily defended pockets directly.
They just let the cold do the work.
Exactly. They let the thermodynamics of the environment do the heavy lifting. If a Soviet soldier stopped moving in minus 43-degree weather, he would freeze to death.
But if you tried to light a fire,
If he tried to light a fire to stay warm, or if the unit tried to run their vehicle engines for heat, the light and sound made them perfect targets for the Finnish troops waiting in the dark tree line.
that psychological terror wasn't just the cold and the dark, it was the fact that the forest itself seemed to be shooting at them.
Because once a column was immobilized, the Finnish snipers went to work.
And this is the environment that produced Simo Heihe.
Yes.
Yeah.
A Finnish farmer turned sniper who was dubbed the White Death.
He operated totally alone in the freezing temperatures, dressed entirely in white, and he used a standard rifle without a telescopic sight.
The choice to use iron sights was a very calculated survival mechanism.
Why is that?
A glass scope can catch the glare of the sun and reveal a sniper's position. Furthermore, in those temperatures, breath condensation would freeze on the glass, rendering a scope completely useless.
Oh, that makes total sense.
He would even pack snow into his mouth before taking a shot so the heat of his breath wouldn't be visible in the frigid air.
That is just incredible dedication. And he is credited with over 500 confirmed kills.
Unmatched in sniper history.
The Battle of Rate Road really stands as the ultimate masterclass of this strategy, doesn't it?
It does. That Soviet 44th Division, the ones who brought the brass band, they were strung out along a narrow forest road.
And a significantly smaller Finnish force, led by Colonel Hilmar Silasvu, completely cut their retreat.
They chopped the massive division into multiple motius and systematically annihilated them over several days.
The numbers from that battle are insane. The Soviets suffered somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 casualties.
While the Finns lost about 400 men.
And crucially, they captured dozens of tanks, artillery pieces, and desperately needed ammunition from the frozen Soviet columns.
But as incredibly resourceful as these tactics were, asymmetric warfare has a breaking point.
Right. Clever ambushes and bravery can only delay the brutal mathematics of industrial war. They cannot reverse it.
Precisely. By February 1940, the Soviet Union realized that political ideology was losing the war. Stalin was furious, and he was humiliated.
So what did he do?
He placed General Semyon Timoshenko in charge, and Timoshenko instituted a massive pragmatic shift in Soviet strategy.
Because he recognized that sending tank columns deep into the trackless forest to be chopped into firewood was a fool's errand.
Right. Timoshenko pulled his forces back, regrouped, and completely abandoned the blitzkrieg maneuvering.
And where did he focus instead?
He concentrated an overwhelming mass of forces on the Karelian Isthmus. This was the flattest, most direct route to the Finnish heartland, and of course the site of the Mannerheim Line.
So he leaned entirely into the one advantage the Soviets had.
Infinite industrial firepower.
Yeah.
He established a combined arms approach, ensuring that infantry, armor, and artillery were deeply coordinated, which was a massive departure from the disjointed pushes of the previous months.
And then on February 1st, the Red Army unleashed a bombardment of truly unimaginable scale.
They fired 300,000 artillery shells into the Finnish defensive positions in a single 24-hour period.
Just trying to comprehend the concussive reality of 300,000 shells is horrifying.
It physically alters the geography.
Yeah, the sheer kinetic energy of that barrage pulverized the concrete bunkers and collapsed the trench networks of the Mannerheim Line.
And under the constant cover of this artillery, the Soviet infantry and armor began a slow, methodical grind forward.
But the Finnish defenders fought with astonishing desperation.
They really did. They would take shelter deep underground during the daylight bombardments and then work frantically through the freezing night to rebuild their shattered trenches before the dawn assaults.
But the relentless pressure exposed Finland's fatal weakness.
A lack of logistical depth.
They were simply running out of physical matter. Artillery units were literally ordered to hold their fire unless there was a direct massed ground attack, because they had no shells left.
And the men in the trenches were exhausted fighting for weeks without sleep, and there were no reinforcements to replace the dead and wounded.
The front line was buckling, and the Finnish government recognized that total military collapse was imminent.
They had to seek terms.
So on March 12, 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed, ending the hostilities.
The terms dictated by Stalin were incredibly harsh. Finland was forced to cede 9% of its total territory to the Soviet Union.
This included Viipuri, their second largest city, and a massive portion of their industrial capacity.
Which was actually substantially more territory than the Soviets had originally demanded during the diplomatic talks in 1939.
The human cost of that treaty reshaped the demographics of the country practically overnight.
It was devastating. Over 400,000 Karelians, representing 12% of Finland's entire population, were forced to pack up whatever they could carry on sleds and evacuate deep into the new Finnish borders.
They chose to abandon their ancestral homes rather than live under Soviet occupation.
Yeah.
When you look at that outcome, losing 9% of your land, your industrial center, and suffering tens of thousands of casualties, it begs the ultimate so what question.
Right. Did Finland actually achieve anything by fighting?
Exactly. Did they win anything?
Well, if you measure victory strictly by acreage, it was a defeat. But when you place the Winter War in the broader geopolitical context of 1940s Europe, the outcome was an astonishing preservation of the state.
Because look at the alternatives.
Exactly. Consider the fate of the Baltic states or Poland. They were entirely absorbed, their governments dissolved, and their populations subjected to mass deportations.
But because the Finnish military made the invasion so incredibly costly in Soviet blood and treasure, Stalin concluded that occupying the entire country would result in an endless, agonizing insurgency.
So he settled for the territorial buffer he originally wanted, and Finland remained an independent, sovereign democracy.
The guns fell silent in March 1940, but the 105-day conflict immediately altered the grand strategy of the major world powers.
Oh, massively. This tiny, isolated war in the Arctic Circle set off a global ripple effect that changed the entire timeline of World War II.
First, it exposed the profound disorganization of the Allied powers.
Right. France and Britain had publicly debated sending expeditionary forces to aid Finland, but their plans were convoluted, bogged down by logistical nightmares, and secretly motivated by a desire to occupy Swedish iron ore mines to cut off German supply lines.
Rather than actually fighting the Soviets.
Exactly. And the Allied failure to intervene caused a political crisis that actually resulted in the collapse of the French government.
But the most consequential ripple effect took place in Berlin.
Yes, Adolf Hitler and the German high command were studying the Winter War obsessively.
They watched the massive Red Army, with its thousands of tanks and aircraft, get utterly humiliated by a fraction of their number in ski troops.
And Hitler looked at this performance and concluded that the Soviet Union was, in his own words, a rotten structure.
He became convinced that if Germany kicked in the door, the entire Soviet apparatus would instantly collapse.
That specific observation directly accelerated Hitler's timeline for Operation Barbarossa.
The catastrophic German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941.
He wildly underestimated Soviet resilience, basing his military projections almost entirely on the Red Army's disastrous early performance in the Finnish snow.
And the historical irony there is profound for you as a listener to really digest. The Winter War convinced Hitler that the Soviets were weak enough to invade, but the humiliating defeats in Finland were exactly the wake-up call Stalin needed.
Absolutely. After the treaty with Finland, the Soviets painfully realized their doctrines were fundamentally broken.
So they reduced the meddling power of the political commissars, reinstated experienced military officers, and drastically overhauled their winter warfare tactics and logistical supply chains.
The war that made Hitler confident enough to invade the Soviet Union is the exact catalyst that forced the Soviet Union to implement the military reforms necessary to survive that invasion.
If the Red Army had faced the German Wehrmacht in 1941 with the same rigid, politically paralyzed command structure they utilized in Finland in 1939, well, the Eastern Front and the outcome of World War II would likely have looked entirely different.
It is an incredibly potent narrative of geopolitical arrogance meeting unparalleled resilience.
The superpower expects a 2-week parade, brings a brass band, and walks into a frozen meat grinder against a nation of farmers and foresters defending their homes.
It serves as a permanent historical testament to how extreme terrain, severe weather, and absolute desperation can act as massive force multipliers, neutralizing overwhelming technological superiority.
But I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, something that severely complicates the romantic underdog story we usually prefer in history.
And this is an important point.
Think about the agonizing moral compromises forced upon a desperate nation. After the brutal Moscow Peace Treaty, Finland was left geopolitically isolated, terrified, and acutely aware that the Western allies were incapable of helping them.
They knew the Soviet Union might return to finish the job.
Picture yourself in that situation, watching the map of Europe turn dark. What would you do to ensure your country's survival?
It is a state of terrifying vulnerability.
And that exact vulnerability is what pushed democratic Finland into a highly controversial military co-belligerence with Nazi Germany just 15 months later.
Yeah.
During what is known as the Continuation War, as they attempted to win back their lost Karelian territory.
It's a stark reminder.
It proves that in the desperation of global conflicts, the line between good guys and bad guys is rarely written in black and white. It is usually written in the desperate shades of survival. It leaves you wondering, standing in that freezing, trackless forest, entirely surrounded by wolves, who do you invite in to help you fight them off?